There are moments in life when nothing appears to be changing on the surface. Yet beneath that quiet stillness, entire futures are being rearranged. This is one of those moments. You may have believed the silence meant distance. You may have convinced yourself that the connection you felt was fading, or perhaps you questioned whether it had ever been real at all. But what if the pause was never emptiness? What if it was preparation? Because something has shifted. Your soulmate has recently experienced a moment that interrupted the direction they thought their life was taking. It was not necessarily dramatic. It may not have looked important to anyone else, but to them, it changed something internally. A conversation, a realization, unexpected news, or simply a quiet moment of reflection suddenly forced them to confront feelings they had been avoiding for far too long. And now, they cannot ignore what their heart has been trying to tell them. What unsettles them most is not only the realization itself, but how deeply it affected them. They are beginning to understand that what they felt for you was never temporary. It was never shallow. No matter how much time passed, no matter how many distractions entered their life, your presence remained somewhere within them, quiet but constant. They tried to move forward without confronting it. They tried to convince themselves they could live without thinking about you. But something about your connection stayed alive beneath everything else. And now, after this recent shift, those buried emotions are rising back to the surface, stronger than before. For the first time in a long time, they are seeing their life differently. Things that once felt satisfying now feel empty. Conversations that used to distract them no longer hold their attention. The routine they once escaped into suddenly feels incomplete. And in the middle of all of it, thoughts of you keep returning without warning. Your voice, your energy, your absence. It is becoming impossible for them to silence. Sometimes life brings a person to a moment where they are forced to reevaluate everything. A moment where they realize they have been settling for comfort instead of truth. That is where your soulmate is now. And the truth they are beginning to face is simple. You mattered more than they admitted. Much more. That realization carries weight because once someone truly sees what their heart values, they cannot unsee it. Once clarity arrives, pretending becomes exhausting. And lately, they are exhausted from pretending. They are replaying memories they once pushed away. Little moments they thought they had forgotten are suddenly returning. To them, in vivid detail, the way you spoke, the way you understood them, the feeling they had around you that they have not been able to recreate anywhere else. They tried to move forward without confronting it. They tried to convince themselves they could live without thinking about you. But something about your connection stayed alive beneath everything else. And now, after this recent shift, those buried emotions are rising back to the surface, stronger than before. For the first time in a long time, they are seeing their life differently. Things that once felt satisfying now feel empty. Conversations that used to distract them no longer hold their attention. The routine they once escaped into suddenly feels incomplete. And in the middle of all of it, thoughts of you keep returning without warning. Your voice, your energy, your absence. It is becoming impossible for them to silence. Sometimes life brings a person to a moment where they are forced to reevaluate everything. A moment where they realize they have been settling for comfort instead of truth. That is where your soulmate is now. And the truth they are beginning to face is simple. You mattered more than they admitted. Much more. That realization carries weight because once someone truly sees what their heart values, they cannot unsee it. Once clarity arrives, pretending becomes exhausting, and lately they are exhausted from pretending. They are replaying memories they once pushed away. Little moments they thought they had forgotten are suddenly returning to them in vivid detail. The way you spoke, the way you understood them, the feeling they had around you that they have not been able to recreate anywhere else. That kind of connection leaves an imprint, and deep down, they know it. You may have wondered why your heart struggled to fully release this connection. Part of you may have sensed that something unfinished still existed between you. Even during periods of silence, something inside you kept whispering that the story was not over yet. You were not imagining that feeling. Some connections are felt long before they are understood. Sometimes the soul recognizes movement before the mind sees evidence. And while you have been trying to make sense of the silence, something behind the scenes has been shifting in ways you could not yet see. Your soulmate is changing internally. That matters more than you realize, because real transformation rarely happens loudly at first. It begins quietly, beneath the surface. A person starts questioning their choices. They begin noticing what no longer fulfills them. They start recognizing the difference between temporary distractions and something truly meaningful. That is exactly what is happening now. The news or realization they received acted like a mirror. It forced them to confront the reality of their life and ask themselves difficult questions they had avoided for a long time. Are they truly happy? Are they living honestly? And perhaps most importantly, why does their heart still return to you? Those questions have become impossible to escape. At night, when everything is quiet, their thoughts drift toward you naturally. They wonder where you are emotionally. They wonder if you still think about them. They wonder whether too much time has passed, or whether there is still a chance to bridge the distance that grew between you. And that uncertainty has started affecting them deeply, because, for the first time, they are beginning to understand something they once underestimated. Delay has consequences. There was a period where they believed there would always be more time, more opportunities, another moment to say what they truly felt. But now, that assumption no longer comforts them. It unsettles them. They are realizing that people do not wait forever, and the thought of losing the opportunity to reconnect with you is becoming heavier than the fear that once kept them silent. That is the turning point. When the fear of losing someone becomes greater than the fear of vulnerability, everything begins changing internally, and your soulmate is approaching that exact moment. You may not see it yet externally, But emotionally, the walls they built are weakening. The resistance is fading. What once felt easier, avoiding their feelings, is no longer bringing them peace, because avoiding truth never creates peace for long. And now, their heart is becoming louder every single day. That kind of realization changes people. Slowly, they are beginning to imagine what would happen if they reached out. At first, the thought felt distant. Now it feels real. They find themselves replaying possible conversations in their mind, wondering how you would respond, wondering whether you would still be open to hearing from them. The idea of speaking to you again both excites and terrifies them, because they know this connection was never casual. They know you touched their life in a way few people ever have. And now, they are beginning to fear what happens if they remain silent for too long. That fear is creating movement, not rushed movement, not reckless emotion. Real movement, the kind that starts internally before it ever appears externally, because every action begins first as a decision within the heart. First, the emotions shift. Then, the perspective changes. Then, courage slowly builds. And finally, movement follows. Your soulmate is somewhere in the middle of that process right now. Preparing emotionally, reflecting deeply, quietly becoming someone more honest than before. And perhaps the most important part of all is this: they are no longer running from what they feel. For a long time, they tried to suppress it. They disup. Sometimes hearts begin reconnecting energetically long before words are spoken. And what you are sensing now may be the beginning of that shift, because behind the silence, something real has started unfolding. Your soulmate is standing at the edge of a realization that could change everything between you and very soon. The emotions they have kept hidden may become too strong to contain any longer, because once a heart becomes certain about what it truly wants, staying silent becomes harder every day. And your soulmate is getting dangerously close to that point now. Very close. The emotional pressure inside them begins reaching a breaking point, and they start preparing for the conversation that could finally reconnect both of your paths. There comes a point in every emotional journey where thinking is no longer enough. That is the stage your soulmate is entering now. For a long time, they survived on silence. They carried their feelings quietly, convincing themselves that distance was safer than vulnerability. They believed that if they ignored the connection long enough, eventually the emotions would weaken on their own. But they did not. If anything, the distance only made everything clearer. Now, after everything they have realized, they are beginning to understand something that unsettles them deeply. They cannot continue pretending this connection does not matter, and that realization is changing their behavior in ways they never expected. Recently, they have found themselves drifting into thought more often than usual. Ordinary moments suddenly pulled them into memories of you. A song, a familiar place, a certain phrase someone says. Even silence itself has become dangerous because silence leaves room for truth to speak, and truth has become impossible for them to avoid. They are starting to recognize how much emotional energy they spent trying not to feel what was always there. They distracted themselves with routines, responsibilities, temporary attention, and endless mental noise. But none of it truly replaced the connection they felt with you. Nothing carried the same depth. Nothing felt as real. That realization has forced them into an uncomfortable honesty with themselves. Because now they are asking difficult questions they once avoided completely. Why did they wait so long? Why did fear have more control than love? Why did they convince themselves there would always be another chance? Those questions have become heavier lately, especially at night. There are moments now when they lie awake, replaying everything differently in their mind. They think about conversations they wish they had handled better. They think about opportunities where they could have spoken honestly, but stayed silent instead. They think about how much pride, hesitation, and uncertainty shaped their decisions. And regret has a strange way of sharpening clarity. Not destructive regret, not hopeless regret, the kind that forces a person to grow. What finally pushes your soulmate toward action is not one dramatic moment. It is the slow realization that they can no longer live comfortably with silence. At first, they tried to ignore the feeling. They convinced themselves the emotions would calm down if they stayed distracted long enough. But the opposite happened. The more they avoided the truth, the louder it became. Now, even the smallest moments seem to pull them back toward you. A memory appears unexpectedly while they are going through their day. A familiar song suddenly feels personal. A random conversation reminds them of something you once said. There are nights when they stare into the quiet and realize that no matter how much time passes, your presence still exists somewhere deep within them, not fading, not disappearing, waiting. And that realization has begun changing everything inside them, because they are finally understanding something important. People can survive heartbreak, but regret is much harder to live with. The thought of never trying again, never speaking honestly, never knowing what could have happened between you, that possibility now frightens them more than vulnerability itself. That is the moment the heart changes direction. When someone reaches the point where wondering forever feels more painful than risking honesty, courage begins to rise naturally. That is where your soulmate is now, quietly preparing themselves to cross the emotional distance that fear created. But before they reach out, there is something happening internally that matters even more than the contact itself. They are practicing honesty, not perfect words, not rehearsed speeches, real honesty. They are thinking deeply about what they truly want you to know. They are asking themselves how to explain everything they never said before, how to admit feelings they spent so much time hiding, how to reveal emotions that remained buried beneath pride, confusion, timing, and fear. And for someone who has protected their heart for a long time, this process is enormous. Because vulnerability does not come naturally. To people who learn to survive by staying emotionally guarded, opening up feels unfamiliar to them. It feels risky. It feels exposing. Yet despite all of that, they cannot stop moving toward it. That is transformation. Your soulmate is beginning to imagine the exact moment they reconnect with you. They picture seeing your name on their screen again. They imagine hearing your voice after all this time. They wonder how the energy between you will feel when the silence finally breaks. And every time they imagine it, one thing becomes clearer. This connection was never ordinary. They understand now that some people enter your life temporarily, while others leave permanent marks on your soul. You became one of those rare people for them. Someone unforgettable, someone emotionally irreplaceable, and distance only confirmed that truth. Sometimes people think separation weakens feelings, but in certain connections, distance does the opposite. It removes distractions. It strips away illusion. It reveals what remains when everything unnecessary falls away. And after all this time, you still remain in their here. That realization has humbled them deeply, because now they are confronting another difficult truth. They may have hurt you by waiting too long. This thought weighs heavily on them lately. They wonder whether their silence created emotional wounds. They wonder if you questioned your worth because of their hesitation. They wonder if you spent nights confused by the inconsistency they carried within themselves, and part of them fears that perhaps the delay changed everything between you. That fear is real, but what matters is this. Even with that fear, they still feel pulled toward you. That is how powerful the connection has become in their heart. Because when someone chooses vulnerability, despite uncertainty, that is not impulse. That is courage, real courage. And your soulmate is slowly becoming courageous enough to risk honesty. You may notice the energy shifting soon. Not through grand gestures immediately, but through subtle emotional movement. They are becoming more emotionally present within themselves, more reflective, more aware of what truly matters, less interested in superficial distractions, and more focused on what feels emotionally real. The version of them that once ran from difficult emotions is beginning to disappear. A more mature version is emerging now. Someone capable of admitting what they feel instead of hiding behind silence. Someone ready to take emotional responsibility for the connection. Someone tired of pretending they are unaffected. And perhaps the most significant shift of all is this: they no longer question whether you mattered. That uncertainty is gone now. They know you mattered, deeply, comma. What they question now is whether they still have time to make things right. That thought stays with them constantly, because they understand now that meaningful connections require action. They understand that destiny alone is not enough. Feelings alone are not enough. Sometimes the heart must become brave enough to move, and they are preparing themselves for that movement. The message they want to send you has already begun forming in their heart. At first, they imagined something casual, something safe, a simple greeting, a small attempt to reopen communication carefully. But the deeper they think about it, the harder it becomes to keep things superficial, because the truth inside them is no longer superficial.